go ahead and make sure we have enough time for questions at the end that from the attendees and not just from me. So I want to go ahead and welcome everybody to the Advocacy and Electronic Records session from SERI, the State Electronic Records Initiative. We are very happy to have you here today, and we'll be having a panel discussion. We don't have a set presentation in mind. Instead, we're going to have a free-flowing discussion on several topics relating to advocacy and electronic records, including, of course, questions coming from y'all. So thanks for being here. I do want to point out that November 16th is the next SERI webinar, Digital Preservation Policies as Tools for Accountability, Compliance, and Clarity. And then we do encourage you to also check out our resource center for COSA at the statearchivist.org/resources/resource center. That is if you haven't used it before, I do encourage you to check that out. There are resources from all the states that are in COSA on various topics, especially relating to digital records. It could be relevant if you're here in this discussion today. Next slide, please, Sarah. We do have online recordings that we encourage you to check out. We especially want to recommend here in October the FAQs on BitRot. You can follow that at the YouTube link here. It's also available through the COSA. Just go on YouTube to search for COSA, and you can also find the COSA YouTube channel that way. BitRot is especially appropriate to look at in October because it's truly one of the horror stories of our field, and it is the spooky month after all. So it is a very good month indeed to learn more about BitRot. Next slide, please, Sarah. SERI would like to thank Preservica. As part of its continued support of state archives and the great work done by COSA, Preservica is excited to sponsor the State Electronic Records Initiative and to help spread knowledge of the electronic records management and digital preservation best practices available to the state and territorial government community. We thank you very much, Preservica, for allowing us to be here today. Thank you so much. Next slide. I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's session. We have Kathy Jordan from the Library of Virginia. We have Sarah Coons from the State Archives of North Carolina, Alan Ramsey from the Connecticut State Library, and Tyler Stump from the Pennsylvania State Archives. This is a really good panel, in my opinion. Hopefully you all agree with the end. But we have folks here who have worked with policymakers. We have folks who work with records custodians. We have folks who work with IT. I think all of us wear several different hats in our jobs. So I am really looking forward to hearing what these fine folks have to say on advocacy and electronic records. And that said, I think we can go ahead and jump into our discussion. So Sarah, you'll bring us our next slide, and this will be our slide we're going to stay on until we get to our general Q&A. These are the 5 big questions that I'm hoping that we'll cover today in our panel. And the first one is on the elevator speech. So this is, we know that when we're dealing with people that have very tight schedules, that sometimes it can be difficult to keep their attention for an hour-long webinar or a 30-minute presentation. So when you get a chance to speak to somebody who is a policymaker or a records custodian or IT in a very short length of time, what's the kind of elevator pitch that you use to get those folks who are not archivists or records managers interested in electronic records management or preserving digital records? Who would like to start?
I could start with something.
Okay.
I would suggest a good place to start is to look at the COSA YouTube video or on the YouTube channel about making a pitch for electronic records. It's a little short video, just a few minutes. The SERI Education Committee worked on it, and that has a nice little succinct layout of steps to consider in terms of things like considering your audience, having a hook so you can explain your problem, in a really brief, succinct manner, have an idea of what a possible solution would be, what you may want to ask of somebody, and then have an opportunity for follow-up. In terms of specifics, I think if you find yourself quickly talking to someone and you don't have a chance to prepare, so if, for example, this isn't an appointment, but I'm going into someone's office, I like to start with being aware of who I'm speaking to, especially if it's a higher up IT professional. So it might be different if they're in the legal field versus the security field. So I kind of have a couple of different hooks that I like to think about when I'm talking to somebody on the fly. One way that I've got that hook going, if it's something a little bit between a formal appointment and on the fly, say, for example, if I'm giving a tour to a legislator, if they're fascinated with maps and we're looking at maps in the search room, I say, aren't these all cool? But now imagine these are all, electronic records. These are all GIS data layers that we have to preserve. And this is much more complex than just putting maps in a filing cabinet. So sometimes I like to do that. I like to kind of find a connection to something they like in an analog world and then say, now imagine this is all electronic. These are really neat maps, but I spend all my time now thinking about electronic records. And that usually kind of makes a nice transition for a hook. So that's what I would offer on getting started anyway.
Thank you, Sarah. Has anyone else had that kind of success of maybe using an analog to get people's hooked and then switch over to electronic, or maybe another strategy that you found to be useful?
Yeah, I would just echo some of what Sarah said, and we had the bunch of the upper IT, statewide IT staff here, including the chief information officer at our site. And so because we're talking about the last gubernatorial transition. And so we actually literally walked over to the paper side from previous administrations and said, look at how much there is in paper, and then translate, try to hook with digital. Sometimes too, I don't have a particular elevator pitch that I got to work on that, but another thing that sometimes we have to do is actually back up a step and actually say that we have a state library and a records management program before we even get into the what about electronic records, because sometimes there's not even that knowledge out there, unfortunately. So just some things to think about.
And Tyler, I know that you might have a position on the pitch because you tend to talk more to the custodians, so it's a little bit of a different pitch.
Yeah, I spend a lot of my time talking with folks who work in different state agencies and also a lot of local government people. And the thing I was going to say, maybe not an elevator pitch for electronic records in general, but I do have a story that I like to tell when I'm doing training or when I have a chance to chat with folks, partially about protecting records and like why following records management best practices is a good thing with electronic records. But back in the 90s, when the Pixar company was making Toy Story 2, the story is, and you can look this up, the story is that they were almost finished the movie and somebody did something and like deleted the whole thing, like an entire year's worth of work to make this whole digital or animated movie all gone. And it turned out either, I think they had a backup, but it was really old or something, or the backup was corrupted as well. So they thought they lost the whole thing. And then it turned out one of their animators was at home on maternity leave, and she had brought a version of it home so she could render some of the images in the movie or something. And so they like went over to her house and had to take the computer and drove it back to the studio with like a police escort or something. And were able to restore the film. And so I say, Pixar, who all they do all day is just like make digital things, and it's so important, and they still made a mistake like this. And so like all of us can make the same mistakes too. But again, it's just a reminder of it's really important, and that's why we have to back up files, and that's why we have to monitor them and make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be and nothing is corrupted or things like that. And so I say, if it could happen with as big a thing as like a Hollywood movie, it can happen to us too. And so that seems to resonate, or at least it's a little more interesting of a story than most of the other ones that I tell. So that's been pretty successful. I've definitely used that for the past couple of years, ever since I read about it. So I would encourage you to maybe pick something up like that, or another horror story that'll really stick in someone's mind when you're talking with them.
So do they say, okay, so we should be sure to bring our computers home with us?
No one's ever said that.
That's something important we're working on. Sorry.
Yeah, not what I'm going for.
That's
but-
not the lesson here. No.
Get back on the elevator.
Wait, we have more floors. No.
Yeah.
I mean, Kathy, you wear a lot of hats at the Library of Virginia. I mean, do you want to, with election, so do you want to maybe say what those titles are and then how the pitch might differ depending on your audience?
Yeah, I mean, or who I am. So I'm the interim state archivist, but my day job, so to speak, is as our head of digital initiatives. But I've been at the library for 21 years and I've worked in a lot of different areas. So I think one of the special gifts that I can bring to an elevator pitch is having an awareness of what all of your colleagues do, having awareness of the full institution, because I think an elevator pitch is just an entree, right? Like, I don't know, you have to kind of decide what it is you want to get out of an elevator pitch. You're not going to, I mean, it would be awesome if in 90 seconds it was like, oh my God, you're so right. We're going to give you a whole lot of money and a whole lot of staff because you just convinced me that we don't want to be like Pixar, right? So I think that it's a good thing to do because it raises awareness, but I think it's a repetitive task. It's about persistence. And I think, as my co-panelists say, you got to know your audience. You got to know where their interest is. You got to be aware that, especially if they're, a high ranking person who has people knocking on their doors all the time, they're going to be getting a lot of this type of stuff. So if you can make it as, dip your toe in as you go is what I would say to do. I mean, I have opportunities. I work with our open data portal in Virginia, and I work closely with the chief data officer who is over across the street. And so, my opportunities for advocating about us go beyond just the thing we talk about, right? Roger Christman is on the call, and he probably does most of the he does probably an elevator pitch every single time he talks to people over in the governor's office. Because you have to keep doing it. I mean, I don't know if that's good or bad, but I think being succinct, being clear, and being able to adjust and respond is what you need to be able to do.
Thank you so much, Kathy.
Is that a bummer? That might be a bummer.
No, I mean, it's realistic. It's not a bummer. I think, we don't want people leaving this discussion to come out thinking that all we have to do to get funding for electronic records management and digital records preservation is just say one time that it's a really good thing. There's a lot more to it than that. And sometimes you can talk to your blue in the face and it won't work, but we can keep on trying.
Yeah. And sometimes they're not going to pay any attention unless you happen to be in the news about it. So.
Like your Toy Story analogy, Tyler.
Exactly.
I mean, yeah, you want, we actually use that line when we're doing records management training in North Carolina. We say, if somebody sends us something that's, a little bit interesting, we're like, there hasn't been a case study on this yet. You don't want to be the case study on it. You don't want to get into the news about this. You don't want a news article saying that your town is the one that accidentally deleted everybody's personnel file in a migration. Like, you don't want that to happen. So it's a good incentive, for lack of a better term, to keep it away. And maybe that's a good transition into we have 3 different audiences I think we want to talk about today for why we have advocacy, or who we advocate to, I should say. Because there's policymakers, there's the IT people we have to work with that aren't necessarily archivists or records managers, and the records custodians themselves. And sometimes the same person may be in all 3 of these. But how we pitch it might be different. So first, we'll talk about policymakers. Aside from the elevator pitch, if you actually have a chance to lay out something to policymakers about why electronic records management matters, why we need the budget for electronic records management, or why we need the budget to keep born digital records long-term in an archival setting, what are the kinds of points or carrots and sticks that you use to get this on their radar and to make them care, if possible? Like, if you have any success stories or stories that we can learn from, those are great too. Kathy, I saw you shaking your head yes. So would you like to start on this one?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I think one of the things that we have found to be pretty successful is that we've leveraged the successes we've had in the past to ask for more. When we took on, when we made the decision to start dealing with Governor Tim Kaine's email, we did that, basically with little or no resources. We just kind of winged it, and we've grown it. And so when we came to the point where we needed to ask the governor in a budget request, and of course, a lot of this is going to depend a lot on how your state works and how you're allowed to address these issues, how I'm not walking over to talk to some state senator about something. I might get in a little trouble for doing that, so we have to work within the boundaries we have. But when we put in our budget requests for new systems, including a library management system, discovery layer, we put in digital preservation as a component, and we pointed to the insane amount of content we've been receiving. We pointed to the needs to do these types of things. And so between like being articulate, being on top of it, making the progress you can, maybe with little or no resources, doing what you can, I think is a big step I think it was a big step in what made us feel confident. And I think our confidence showed in the documentation. And then we were able to get that support. I mean, happily, it happened to coincide with a period of when we were pretty flush and there was money to be had. And in other instances, yeah, some of the stuff we have gotten funding for is because we got in the press a little bit about some stuff. Sometimes it was, a legit thing that happened, and other times it was, this is one of the problems. Like, oh, if I'd only gotten that guy on an elevator, maybe I could have headed this off before we started saying we should do what WikiLeaks does, or something like that, right? Where we're like, oh, and maybe not, but it's how it all comes together. So I don't
I
even.
like the idea of proof of concept. That makes a lot of sense. You can demonstrate that the project has worked before. We know how to do it. And the budget that we're suggesting isn't just theoretical numbers. We know what it takes to do the project. So that makes a lot of sense.
It helped us in that instance anyway, I think, for sure.
Alan, have you had a similar experience?
Well, yeah, in a way. So in Connecticut, our IT has been pretty centralized, although some agencies can sort of do what they want in some ways. And so a lot of agencies end up going to them, especially digitization projects and things, and they know there's a records management program, thankfully. So we're usually at the table. We did a proof of concept for a records retention schedule repository. And we all went away for the holiday thinking we'll have time to, and this was years ago, we'll have time to analyze our proof of concept data. And we all came back from the Christmas holiday, and surprise, they bought the product. So be aware that sometimes if you do proof of concept, you might get what you didn't think you were going to get. And it was something that now we have to work with. It's not the most ideal product, but the company that was selling it lumped it with everything else as a discount package at the end of the year. So, and then we've had other proof. We just went through proof of concept with a state agency for our enterprise content management work, and they started realizing that it's more than just one unit that has to be on the digital um, pathway, so to speak, for lack of a better term, and that there's so many different other pieces and units and things that but they were at least able to do the proof of concept to now show their commissioner, deputy commissioners, and other senior staff of the agency that this is doable, that you can scan material or ingest born digital into the content management, and then eventually it can be legally disposed of. So we're not storing things forever that we shouldn't be storing. So just two kind of examples that stick out to me as we're talking here.
Thank you very much, Alan. I appreciate it. I know, Sarah, you've done a lot of advocacy work at various levels. You've gone to the federal level as well for advocacy. So, do you want to relay some of your experiences with those projects?
Well, I think on the federal level, usually that's going to look like a formal appointment and you have limited time. And so I think that's about thinking through carefully what you bring with you. You want to leave something behind and it needs to be succinct. And you might want to bring someone with you who is very conversant in the same issues, and then you can go back and forth, or someone can pick up, so it's more conversational. But you do want to be prepared for those sorts of meetings, because you often are going to get a short amount of time with a junior staffer. So it helps to be prepared on that, in that space. Couple things that come to mind listening to Kathy and Alan talk. You know, if you find yourself in a place where you don't have a proof of concept, or you don't have a track record of getting something done, I would encourage folks to be aware of what's going on in other spaces. So for example, I might say, look at what Virginia is doing with their governor's records archives and have an example, or find something that resonates with that policymaker on their professional level. There's resources with the National Governors Association and COSA that talk about records management in transition, for example. We've done webinars with them. Sometimes they will respond well to their own colleagues or their own level of the profession. So that helps too, I think, to come in with, if you don't have something right in your tool belt that says, hey, I've already done this project, or I've got this product scoped out and I think we need to buy it. If you don't have that, look around and see what you like from other states that seems to work, and use that as an example. So I just would throw that out there too.
Thank you, Sarah. And something that Kathy mentioned that maybe any of you can touch on. I think you're right, Kathy, in that in a lot of states, most, if not all, state employees are a bit restricted as to what they can do when they approach policymakers, especially at the state level. Maybe not municipal or federal, but maybe so as well. So in terms of convincing policymakers, what are ways that we can mobilize other archivists who aren't at public institutions, or other folks just in general, to get interested and maybe send letters to policymakers or reach out for us if we can't approach them directly?
That might be a space for getting records custodians on the same page, getting other allied organizations, like maybe a genealogical society, where it's in their interest that we have records preserved and made accessible. I think you'd be surprised, they're not all interested in the old stuff. They do understand that modern records, need care and feeding that are different than paper records. So that might be a space, to your point, Josh, to find allies within your state or your region that could speak to that. Or maybe there's a professional archival association on the state level or the regional level that could weigh in as well.
Thank you, Sarah. I just know that's a possible barrier for those of us on the call who, if we work at a state archives. But what isn't a barrier by policy usually is working with IT. So let's transition to advocacy with IT folks, because it's really a partnership between state archives and IT. It depends on the state if IT is a separate department or part of the archives and part of other departments. Like Alan said, in Connecticut, it's very centralized. So in my experience, at least, IT is very helpful with us, but a lot of times the priorities for IT when it comes to records management aren't the same as ours. And they may not even think through some of the concerns that we have in terms of records management or long-term preservation of a file. So how do you communicate with IT to try to build that partnership and advocate for the RM and the archive side of working with electronic records? Tyler, I know that you said you had something on this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really important, and I think it's I've kind of encountered this on the state side and then also with local government. And I think the biggest thing is to make sure that like the records or archives folks and the IT folks kind of understand where each other is coming from. And I've just found even sometimes it's as simple as the same word can mean different things to both sides. Where like, for an IT person, if you're archiving a file or, electronic records, that can mean something totally different from what we would mean. And there's things like that. So I think that's really important. And I think IT folks, or at least that I've encountered kind of like working on the ground level of these sorts of things, you don't have to know everything about computers and files and electronic systems, but if you at least know enough that you can have a conversation about it and you don't have to have everything explained in the meeting, you've kind of done a little bit of background, or you're kind of sort of familiar with it, you know enough that you know what the issue may be and you can actually explain what that is. I think that goes a long way. And then the other thing I was going to say is, in my experience working with IT folks, pointing to policy has been more effective there than if I might be working with like rank and file administrators or clerks or other records related folks, where if I can just say like, this is what the policy states and it's kind of prescribed here, they seem to kind of listen to that in a more useful way than other folks in other work areas maybe. I don't know if that's just a Pennsylvania thing here, but it seems like pulling out policy has been a much stronger tool when I'm talking in IT crowds than in other ones. So.
Yeah,
Alan, go ahead.
sorry, I just wanted to say real quick, I know that in Virginia, I think there are some allies that we have in, the broader IT, and that would be, people who have to deal with FOIA requests. They'll have an understanding of it, or seek out information security officers. Those are required now in each agency in Virginia. And so they'll have kind of a similar, if not exactly, probably not exactly the same, but a similar perspective on a lot of this, and similar interests in the value and importance of records and managing the records well. That was just a little to refine it a little bit from IT to more like specific roles.
That makes sense. Yeah, I tried to keep it general because, with every state, the roles are different, the titles are different, but absolutely, I agree with you, Kathy. Alan, I saw you shaking your head yes to some of Tyler's points. So do you want to build on that? Because I know you were already mentioned your work with IT.
Yeah, so definitely definitions. That's like really, it sounds, Tyler's right. If you gotta have the right definitions up front. And so when we do our um, uh, business requirement documents as part of projects, we have definitions up front, what our goals are as a group. So both from the records custodian side, the IT side, and the archives and records management side. And then understanding roles. So we can help to bridge some between the records custodian and IT. So we can talk about the records aspect of it and bridge that gap. Like we just, in the most recent project with our environmental agency, we bridge that gap. So some things we could take back and discuss with the business unit so that the IT staff could focus on the technical solutions, which they're really great at. Sometimes I start spewing out technical things like, no, that's not my role. It's good to put those out there, but really that's up to IT once you've got your requirements down to come back and say, here's sort of option A through whatever. So that's just some things that came to mind. Also, one thing that's helped here is we're actually working on a digital policy right now. So actually having them at the table right at the beginning. Anyone who's interested from our statewide IT involved in that with feedback, and vice versa, being at their table when there's issues and projects, and how we're going to handle the records aspects and the disposition and things of that. So.
And I can mention something like that too for North Carolina that Sarah can expand on in a second. But we have worked with the Department of Information Technology on several best practices documents collaboratively. They will reach out to us and say, can we work on this together? And we'll reach out to them. There often is going to have to be a meeting in the middle of perspective. So a good example of this is within Microsoft 365, which we've been working on our best practices document for the past few months, and we just released last week. DIT wanted to tell folks to not make folders ever in SharePoint and rely on the search function because search is robust. And from a records management point of view, we encourage folks to make folders for a lot of reasons, but specifically because you can line them up with the retention schedule and know what's going to be ready for destruction versus not. Plus a lot of other reasons that are obvious to those of us who are records managers. And, you know, we just had to explain why we agree the search function is robust, but there's a reason that we think a more traditional folder structure makes sense. And here's why. Not that their perspective is wrong, but it's just from our perspective, this is a better approach. But they were able to contribute to the best practices and say, you know, here's what we can do. And we weren't aware of things that they could do on the back end, like, you know, retrieve an audit trail for something very quickly for a particular record, which we knew about audit trails, obviously, but knowing they could do it for an agency upon request very quickly is something that we could add to our best practices. So, Sarah, do you want to mention more about the collaborative relationship that we have with DIT?
Yeah, that's good. That's good background, Josh. And as he said, they just finished up writing an updated document in collaboration with our state agency that is Department of Information Technology. But I think behind the scenes there, a piece about advocacy, and I think this is especially important with IT and for some of your states in a higher level policymakers. I think when you're doing advocacy in this area, expect to constantly be looking for ways to reintroduce yourself, because we have a lot of churn in state IT departments. We're getting ready to have our third head of our Office 365 tenant in 18 months. So, you know, now I have to reintroduce myself to that person. But in part of doing that, you want to be out there sort of telegraphing that you are a conspicuous collaborator. Like, I am there to work with you. I'm not there to get in your lane. I'm not trying to interrupt what you're doing in IT. I'm there to make it better, because I think at some level they share, even if we don't have a common language, governance is very important. They want it, we want it. So, you know, to get to the point where we're writing that shared document, I have to be buddying up to that higher level person who's running our Office 365 instance across the state. And so it's a little disheartening to say, okay, I heard that the second person left. I was like, oh no, now I have to make new friends. But I think it's a good point. It's an ongoing relationship building, especially for IT, I think, because there's a lot of turnover and can be there. And so you just want to make yourself as available as possible. So when they come to you, even if you're frustrated because they could have come to you a year ago to write a SharePoint document, governance document, it would have been a whole lot better than letting people populate, their library with no folders. You still say, great, I'm here to help. And that's when you say, guess what, Josh, you have a new project. We're gonna work on a shared document. So that, I think that's an important piece of that too. It's just knowing that you're gonna have to keep showing up and keep reintroducing yourself and what you do.
Go ahead, Alan.
I was going to say I would agree, Sarah. We have that frustration, but we step back and say, okay, we got to re-educate. And once we get them re-educated, sometimes it works out too, where, you know, luckily we've had a CIO here for a long time, thankfully, so that's ours doesn't follow national trend, thankfully. But everyone under the CIO seems to turn over especially if there's consultants in for a couple years. But sometimes those individuals actually end up in state employment, so they take their skills with them. So now we've got people out there who are like, oh yes, I know there's a records management program, and here's how we do that. But at the same time, we have to educate. So every time we have that, we got to restart. But then it also helps us to reevaluate what we're doing. So it can be frustrating at times when people leave, and you got to kind of go back to square one and start at the beginning.
But I feel like that conspicuous collaboration that you and Sarah are mentioning, doggedly determination, will eventually cultivate the allies that Kathy's talking about. That if we get folks on the IT side who are as passionate about records as we are, even if the language is different, that it's going to make for a better relationship. Because, like Alan, you said, we can speak IT, but we have to speak on behalf of the records. And if they're thinking for the records, but they're from the IT side, it's just better all the way around. We can stay in our lane, but we know each other's lanes. That's better. So we've covered policymakers and IT. So let's get to records custodians, because ultimately advocating for the care of their own electronic records that eventually will come to the archives, or maybe not. Maybe they're just going to be destroyed, but they still have to be taken care of through their life cycle. I mean, that's the front line of electronic records, right? So, what are the ways to get folks who, for them, their day-to-day work, yes, it involves electronic records, but they're not thinking in that terms. They're thinking in terms of, I work on the budget, I work in HR, I work in EMS or something like that. How do you get these folks to think in terms of records as part of their day job?
I think for me, I wrote down earlier because you sent me these questions ahead of time, but the two biggest maybe worries or fears that I have with agency staff or local government staff with electronic records. One is just worrying that they won't apply retention to electronic records in kind of a uniform manner like they are trained to with paper, where we get a lot of people just say, how long do I keep the email? And of course, everyone here knows it depends, because it depends on what each individual email's retention is, depending on what is in it. And the same goes with so many other kinds of records. So that's always a fear that I have. And the other, I think, is just kind of file management in general. Just, we give people the training with electronic records and best practices and policy requirements, but I still just wonder, like, are we actually, like, will that office be able to retrieve those records in 15 years' time, in 50 years' time, after I'm long since retired? Because for some of these things with long-term and permanent retention, or ones that we want to come to the archives ultimately, that's kind of the end goal, but we might not be around to see that happen. So it's just kind of a fear that I have. And so, I try and mitigate this, for at least from my point of view, with training and putting out advice and kind of repetition. For when I do records management training, I start out with basic definitions. What is a record? What is retention? And how do we know what retention is? And then I'll kind of shift into the electronic records portion. And I'll say, now we've kind of covered the basics and theories and stuff like that. Nothing is different here with electronic records. Like, retention is the same. Definition of a record is exactly the same. It just happens to be electronic. And that seems to stick a little bit better, not always, but I think kind of going over and making it clear that for most, not everything, because some things are unique to electronic records, but a lot of the things that we're doing and talking about, the principles are always the same. And so I think if you make it familiar, or people are, oh, this is just like what I do with the paper budget files or something like that. That seems to help for a lot of like rank and file employees that I work with in a lot of different situations.
Thank you so much, Tyler. And Alan, you had mentioned earlier that, sometimes people don't know the records management is there, right? So how do you get that into their mind?
Usually it comes from them reaching out sometimes. In Connecticut, we have records management liaison officers, which are other duties as assigned, and often end up being at the level that isn't always as helpful. But so there, we do have that in each agency that helps. Towns is a little bit more difficult with the varying. We operate. Oversee the records management for the 169 towns in Connecticut. So it's 169 different ways of doing things. So that's always a challenge, and always, we typically work very closely with town clerks, who tend to be the center of a lot of the record keeping in the towns. But it's just, just constantly trying to get ourselves out there in various ways, networking to an extent, and things of that nature, because it is a challenge. And then, like I mentioned, working with our recent project in our environmental protection agency, helping to bridge that gap. So actually getting records creators, custodians, creators to think about how is this going to be accessible not only right now, but into the future. What kind of metadata are you going to need? Do you have it already? If you do, great. If you don't, well, how is this going to work? And things of that nature. So.
Kathy, I think you were starting to make a comment as well. Sorry about that.
Well, no, I mean, I probably have no business saying anything about records management since I'm not a records manager. Because
Well, electronic records, archival records are just as important, obviously.
right, and I mean, I don't even know why I'm here. Roger's the one who should be talking about this because he's always over at the governor's office. But you know, I'll talk anyway. So I think what's coming to my mind, I'm looking at the slide that says teaching records custodians, and I think when you want to advocate, you want to find you want to advocate for the right thing, right? So you have your thing. But I think listening to records custodians is probably a really important thing to do because we can train and we can explain things over and over again. And if we're not seeing a lot of success, we have to ask them what those barriers are. We have to ask them, where are your challenges? Because I think together we're stronger than separate, right? I mean, it's melodramatic, but I mean,
Mhm.
you have to have a conversation, right? Because they also have competing interests. Their jobs are not just to answer your call to records management, right? So there are challenges on their end too. That's that's always kind of been my personal thought. Like when I run into something where I need somebody to do so, I get calls like, hey, I'm this small historical society. Someone told me to call you because you're going to manage digital preservation for me. And it's like, no. So then the job becomes really talking through with them what what their expectations are, what their actual needs are, what their capacity is, and trying to work within that. And I think that's probably maybe, I mean, for me, that's a more satisfying way to go. And I'm not sure if maybe my records management friends would not agree. I don't know. So.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Sarah, would you like to chime in on this one?
Well, I actually would comment on something that just came in through the chat about younger workforce and having not the same context with paper records and being more familiar with electronic records. And something that I had done in the past in previous positions was have examples, all names are changed to protect the guilty from state government where they have done something that was not a good records management thing with electronic records. And then I've pulled that out. So for example, we had an agency that gave us transferred some electronic records and all of them, they were all like image 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, image 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So, then you can speak to best practices about file naming. So I think it is very true that people are, newer generations are more familiar with an more of a electronic environment, but there certainly are some examples that can be pulled up and used for that as well that are, similar to the paper world for records custodians. But I agree with Kathy, listening to their needs can be important because
Yes.
A lot of us in bigger states or you might have an environment with a very large city and then a very small county or a very small town, and their needs are going to be very different in terms of what they have for resources. So it's important to kind of hit that sweet spot, getting back to one of our original points about knowing your audience and how you can tailor your discussions and training to their needs.
Yeah, and if you can help them, you have an ally, right?
Mm-hmm. Good point.
If you scare them, you might not. If you're all terrifying me.
I think healthy fear is not a bad thing, but it is better to make them want to work with you and not the other way around. We always say that we're not the records police when we talk to folks because they're afraid of telling us how things actually are because they think we'll be mad at them or get the district attorney on them, and we're like, no, we want to work with you. We care about your records.
You would be furious with me.
I have to share this story. We had a county that had that someone had gotten into and taken all their files. So like almost every county office was completely wiped out. So I had gotten a call from the legal department, the school of government, asking me if I was going to prosecute them for willfully destroying public records if they didn't pay the ransom for the ransomware attack. And I was like, no, that doesn't seem like what is the point of that? So that's to your point about it. I don't want to make any enemies. I would rather just say, no. Let's talk about documenting what's gone.
Mentioned ransomware. I mean, we'd be remiss. That's also a good thing to work with IT and other people. That's across the board. It's a ongoing and increasing threat to electronic records. So that's another reason that the advocacy is so important, to try to get the right stuff in place before that happens. So I may leave a few minutes for questions. So our last question on here: let's say your advocacy is so effective that now you have champions for digitization and for born digital records, and eventually you get the question that comes in that's almost inevitable when they think electronic records, and we've convinced them that we can take care of them. Why don't you just scan it all? I know we've been asked this from people outside the institution. So, and I know Tyler told me he wanted to start this one. So Tyler, when someone asks, why don't we scan it all? What do you say?
Yeah, well, first, I think that's a good question for us to get for a couple of reasons. It shows that people want to look at the records. Like, shouldn't we all be excited about that? We're here to provide access, so people are excited about records. And it also shows that people already know that not everything is digitized, so they've been thinking about what we have and how to access it. But I think for me, I mean, there's kind of two things that I think are the most important with this. But one is, I think a lot of the labor that we do in archives is pretty hidden and it's not really well known. So I've talked about like the birth and death records that we have, birth and death certificates, which is one of our most popular collections. People look at it all the time. And it usually takes, just to get 1 year's worth of birth certificates online and on Ancestry, 1.5 years typically is like from when we open the record and start scanning it to uploading it, assigning metadata and all of that. And that's just for 1 year of birth certificates, which is like a drop in the bucket of all of our collections. And so that kind of, you see like what the bigger picture is and why digitization can get so complicated. We just don't have time to do it all. And then the other thing is, we just talked about there really isn't a need for it. And I know it might not make sense to somebody on the outside, like, well, why wouldn't you want to scan everything? But depending on frequency of access, I mean, some collections don't get looked at all the time. So it's like we need to I always frame it, we need to prioritize, and we're scanning the most important things now, we're putting them online. But for some of the other things that don't get looked at all the time, maybe we'll scan it one day, but we're not going to right now. And I think we have good reasons for that. And just really quick, I'm going to put it in the chat, but one of the best articles or blog posts that I've seen on this topic, why don't you digitize everything? The university, I think it's called Region of Peel Archives. It's over in England, but they have a great blog post that kind of gets into all the different ways to answer this question, which I will share, although I'm sure everyone else will have a different answer than what's in here. But those are the things I wanted to say for that.
Thank you, Tyler. Sarah, I know that you've fielded this question. I've seen you field it during a tour. So how do you handle it?
I very much similar to what Tyler was saying. In one case in a previous administration, I was asked to estimate, how long it would take us to digitize the 7 floors of the record center. So if you have some sort of specific example like Tyler has, or some sort of doomsday scenario about cost, I think that helps. And usually I try not to be too flip or short with people when they say that, but it's a kind of a version of it's the metadata stupid, which sort of gets to Tyler's point about the hidden labor. So it's important to remind people what goes into getting that image online, and and I always say that digitization is not the hard part. So I usually take a similar tactic.
And Kathy, do you take a similar tactic to these two?
I can't actually tell you I've ever legit been asked that question, though I have, thought about it. And I guess in lieu of saying, well, that's bonkers, why would I do that? I would probably end up asking them a lot of questions about it, like, where to kind of try to figure out more about where their thoughts are on it. I don't have a standard answer. I mean, in a way, maybe someday we will digitize it all. I have no idea, but like Tyler said, we're working on it.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I think it would be cool to kind of get into with the people, what is it you're looking for? What does that look like to you? What does digitizing it all actually look like to you? I mean, there might be, I'm with Sarah, metadata, baby. We need some metadata, but you get a you get a genealogist who's been scrolling through microfilm for the past 782 years, they're going to be kind of cool with doing that digitally too, maybe, right? So yeah, I think you just, it's a lot of non-answers for me. I apologize, but I need a lot more information when people ask me that question.
And that it's a valid response to be like, what are you actually,
What?
I mean, what is a reference interview or an interview with the records custodian on the problem they have? If not, what is it you're really asking about?
Right.
And getting at that. So Alan, if you want the last word on it before we open it up for questions.
So agree with everyone, and it depends on who I'm talking with, who brings it up, having that conversation, kind of where they're coming from. We had a fairly high level agency head official who was like, I just saw this really neat, fast, high-speed scanner at the Revenue Services Department. So why don't you just do that here, and we can then shed this building, because we've been going through selling buildings and things because of the partially due to the pandemic, partially due to just winding down the amount of floor space. And I said, well, we can't put the document from the 1800s in there. And then that really got him to think, well, yeah, you couldn't just throw documents from the 1800s. We also had an incident too where the Veterans Affairs Committee of the General Assembly actually asked us to do a study on digitizing all of the veteran records between us and the National Guard, and metadata was big, and so we came up with, we just didn't say, oh, it costs too much, which it did. If we were to do everything, it'd be like $1.2 billion, and probably more than that nowadays, since that study was about 5 years ago. But while we can't maybe scan everything here, we could do where we can make access much better if you funded it at allowing us to hire 2 additional staff members, which none of that worked because it was still all too expensive, but at least we gave options. So definitely, where are they coming from, questioning them on sort of that, and having that conversation of like, what's the idea here?
Thank you so much, Alan. We have our first comment question from the chat from Lisa. She said, isn't part of it access along with preservation? They might be talking about access without understanding that many things are preservation quality and all that goes along with that. So does anyone want to speak to, the priorities might be different for folks. They might understand the difference between preserving an electronic record digitally and providing access to that record.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, go back to, there are a lot of things people don't understand when they ask you to do something like digitize everything in your collection. So, it seems easy, but it is complex. So I think that's when you go back to just, it's helpful, I think, when people come to their own understanding of things, when you talk them through it. But yeah, absolutely. There could be a time when we decide, what, it's so easy to digitize stuff, we're just going to do it. And, maybe some stuff doesn't need any preservation. We'll just do it again if something goes wrong, right? I mean, you never know. Like, you make these decisions like all the time when you're planning this stuff. So it's a hard one.
And certainly, there depends on the public services. If you have a born digital record, how you provide access to it is an ongoing question, right? And every state, every archival repository probably has a slightly different procedure for if they provide it virtually, remotely, if they make a person come into the search room and look at a dedicated machine. Is there authentication required, things like that? So that's an ongoing question for sure. And it's a distinct question from the back end preservation of these born digital records, I would say.
Yeah, and I don't know if digitization means we can get rid of all of our old records either. I'm not really on board with that.
No. So we're waiting for other questions to come in. We did have a comment earlier. Mary said, whether IT is helpful varies from state to state. They're not in my state. So do you want to maybe talk about how to work with, if you're working with other agencies for advocating for the needs of archives and records management, and those agencies have a negative relationship, a confrontational relationship, they're not allies, but you still have to work with them. So how do you push through that and still try to turn it around, make it positive?
One thing that I have done, which has been useful, is to make friends in the state agencies who may have more political clout than your own archives does. There was one time where there was, I think it was the Office of Human Services in the state, and their director was retiring, and we had a good relationship with the office. They had done a lot to send a lot of paper records our way that were historical in the past. And when she retired, we just reached out directly to her and just said, we'd like to get your email to the archives. And so she contacted her IT and said, I want this email transferred over. And IT just jumped to, and it was done. It was very quick. It was perfect. We've tried the same thing when other executive staff have left, and we contact IT and say, we'd like to get these emails, and then it takes forever. And half the time something comes up in the middle of it. So if you can find someone who can get it done really quickly, who you're friendly with, even if you don't have a good relationship with IT, that will kind of flatten any barriers that can get in your way. But that doesn't always work. But when it does, it's awesome.
Thank you, Tyler. Yeah, I would say it definitely is a challenge if you're working with an agency that is, negative. And, I'm in very same boat as Tyler, I'm a records analyst, so I work with a lot of the custodial agencies. And usually the agencies are very happy to have our help. But there are some times where they reach out to us for a question and they don't like the answer we give. And it just requires determination on our side to be very nice, to be, willing to offer those services, but also say, no, we're not going to say that it's fine that all your old records are on floppy disk and you can keep them that way. We're not going to tell you that's okay, but we can help you figure out solutions for migrating those files. We can help you go forward, and just saying it over and over again, like you said, Kathy, repetition, until eventually they realize, oh, we're not trying to work against them. We're trying to work for them. We're trying to help them. When we're advocating for the electronic records and the preservation of electronic records in the archives, we're actually advocating for their work too, either currently with records management or to preserve their work if it's becoming an archival record. So I think that's a really important point.
I would add to that, sometimes you have to reiterate over and over, and sometimes taking in just incremental steps, little steps. So can we do the first, for example, the first 3 schedules, or can we do the first transfer, and you get an idea how it goes. And once that happens, sometimes it ripples. So
it's almost like Kathy's proof of concept earlier. If you can do that one first step,
right.
That's a positive step, even if it's small,
mm-hmm.
then that can lead to more. And that could work with a policymaker, work with a custodian, with IT, any of those audiences we've talked about, establishing that foothold, that niche for you. I heard a phrase before at a different panel that having a seat at the table is the most important part of advocacy, showing you're part of the relationship. And I think that's a really good thing if we can have a seat at the table with policymakers, with, the various kinds of IT staff we'll work with custodians, then we're already, have a leg up, and getting that seat at the table is really important. Thank you, Michelle, for the kind word in the chat. I know we have reached the time. So I think, Sarah, if you'll just advance to the last, the next slide's Q&A. And then the last slide is the stay connected. And so if you want to stay connected with COSA, please reach out through those various means on the screen here. And finally, if you'll go to the last slide, Sarah, there is a webinar evaluation. When you exit this webinar, you'll be given a chance to give us feedback. We hope that you found this webinar interesting. We know it's a less traditional format since it was more of an open discussion, but I think it was really interesting. I certainly learned a lot myself, and I want to take the time to thank Kathy, Alan, Tyler, and Sarah. Thank you so much for your insights and your time today. Thank you, everyone who's been here, for listening in. We appreciate it, and we hope you have had a great Electronic Records Day 2021 and a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.